Welcome back, everybody. So, like I've said before quite a bit, these videos are going to be about making JavaScript games. So we could learn a lot of concepts in JavaScript and a lot of pick up a lot of tricks in coding through making games. I'm going to be remaking all the Atari games, but before I make the games, I want to lay down some groundwork. Now, I already made a video on how to do inheritance in JavaScript because we're going to be using a lot of object-oriented code. The next step I said we were going to do was make a graphical user interface that we're going to reuse all over the across every game we make, and some applications that are not games that we're also going to make games easier. So let's go to one of the games that I made. And see that actually flashed very quickly, but there was a loading screen that was loading some images and stuff. I did it very quickly because my internet connection is very quickly. But things like adding buttons and controlling the window size is all part of the graphical user interface. So let me just start this game. So this dialog windows here is made through a call through an object called T dialog in my graphical user interface. So I could close the dialog if I wanted to. I could do a lot of things. So this game, if you notice, it takes up the full screen of the browser. It takes up the full screen of the browser, and it does that automatically. If I resize it, well, let me just show you a few other things first. Basic things that graphical user interface does is manage dialog boxes. So if I want to exit the game, let's say if I want to go home, I click on this button, which is part of the an object in the graphical user interface. It pops up a window asking me, are you sure you want to quit, with two buttons, yes and no, and a little close buttons. So if I say yes, it'll get me out. If I say no, it'll return me to the game, etc. All of those things are part of the graphical user interface. If I another thing that is part of the graphical user interface is if I want to make sure that my game takes up the entire browser window. So if you see the browser window, the game is taking up the entire browser window. If I were to resize the browser window, make it smaller, the game automatically resizes with the window. So if I make it a little bit bigger, it resizes. That's all part of the graphical user interface. The graphical user interface is automatically adjusting the game size and resizing it to the browser window. So this is the first video in a series of videos for me building a graphical user interface. I'm going to be building a graphical user interface based on I could actually pick any library to implement. We're going to be implementing everything from scratch to make a graphical user interface. But just because I had a book sitting on my shelf and a graphical interface called TurboVision, it's a pretty old graphical user interface. It's called TurboVision from Turbo Pascal, so imagine it's not even used anymore, but it's pretty detailed. So I'm going to be implementing this TurboVision graphical user interface in JavaScript so we could reuse it for our games. Let me show you. I got the book which details each object and its descendant and the properties that it has. So if you know, it's got buttons, it's got groups, it got frameworks, it got all different types of objects, and they all basically descend from this object called T object, and then we got, you know, different objects. So I got the book, and it pretty describes the library with detail, so it's easy for me to implement. So there's no particular reason why I decided to implement this library. I just had a book, and so I decided to go with it. I could have implemented any other libraries, but so far it's working out good for me. So what we're going to do is we're going to implement this library So this is one of the games that I wrote. You could move around, you could jump, you could kneel down, you could walk crouched, you could do pretty much everything. Now the I'm moving it, clicking buttons on the screen. That's actually handled by the graphical interface also. But I could also use my keyboard buttons. So let me get rid of the mouse cursor, and I'm gonna actually press the arrows on my keyboard, and it's gonna move also. So okay, I'm pressing the forward arrow, the back arrow, stop, jump arrow. I'm doing this so my game could not only use the mouse to move my character around, my games also could use the keyboard to move my character around, and all that's done very easily because it's part of the graphical interface I'm going to build. So that's pretty much what the graphical interface is going to do. It's going to do three things. It's going to handle input, whether it be mouse or keyboard. Manage the windows, so it's going to resize. I'm going to give it an ideal dimension for my game, and it's going to resize the game to fit the browser the best way it can. And it's also going to handle dialogue. So if I want to do little dialogue windows like this one that I did, like, are you sure you want to quit? Or for another game, let me go to another game. Another game that I wrote, Cops 3D, which this game is a simple game, but it allows for network playing, multiple player. So right now, the little dialogue is displaying a match saying whether it's waiting for another player, and if somebody through the internet connects, it's going to connect the two players so they could play against each other, or you could say play against the computer, and it's going to display a little dialogue saying it's your turn, it's his turn, and you could move around. So basic graphical user interface. This is what we're going to build. So this is the first video just explaining what we're going to be doing. The graphical user interface I haven't implemented completely. I just implemented enough so I could build a few games, but we're going to implement it completely, recording the videos so you could have a nice little graphical interface to use on all your web applications. And that's pretty much it. So let's go back to the other one, Jungle Adventure. If you saw that it displayed the loading dialog, it's got the buttons, it's got everything to move around. This windows, I could click on the button to close the window. Perfect. So this video, I'm not going to have much code because this is just an introduction video to let you know what the graphical user interface is going to be about. So basically, I'm going to call this JS Vision for JavaScript Vision. It's going to implement the Turbo Vision graphical user interface framework in the JavaScript environment. So this video doesn't go without writing any code. I'm actually going to write a little code. So let me exit out of this. I'm going to exit out of the virtual server where I have implemented the game. So I'm going to log into the virtual server where I'm going to record the videos as implementing all the games and all the libraries. Let's log in. Let's wait for this to exit out. So yeah, this is one of the games we're going to implement together. It's called Jungle Adventure. It's somewhat of a remake of Pitfall. So you can move around. You have your lives. You have your score. You have the ability to turn on and turn off sound. Oh, I'm going to see what happened to the graphics right there. I'm going to fix it. I'm going to see why the graphic is broken. I'll fix that. I move things around, so it's not a problem. And this is one of the games we're going to implement together. We're also going to I actually downloaded a list of all the Atari games, because we're going to start implementing first all the Atari games. Then after that, we're going to implement all the Nintendo games. And only in the Atari games, there's over 100 games we're going to be implementing. So there's going to be a lot of code that we're going to be writing together. Okay, exit out. Let's go into the other environment. I don't want us to go blank without writing a little bit of code. So let's write a little bit of code. So if you see here, this object is called TView. It's pretty much going to create a region on the screen where we could draw to and we could do various things to, which is going to be inherited by all the other objects, windows and dialog boxes, and most visual objects are going to inherit TView. But the beginning object to most object is an object called TObject. This is the starting point to all the object. So what I'm going to do is this is a very simple object to implement, so that we don't go through this video without implementing something. I'm going to implement this object. Okay, it's a very simple object. The other objects like TViews are the complicated object. I'll explain what every object does and how it works. So in this video, I just wanted to take the time to just explain what we're going to do. We're going to build this graphical user interface that we're going to use in all our games. And let's start by building the first object, which is called TObject, which is going to be inherited by mostly every object that we use. Okay, so let's go to a web environment, our web folder. Okay. So we are in the lib.js. That's where we have our JavaScript library. We're going to create a special folder for our graphical user interface. All the code we're going to create for the graphical user interface. And we're going to call it JS Vision for JavaScript Vision. I'm calling it this because the original library was called Turbo Vision, because Turbo Pascal built the graphic library. Since we're building this for JavaScript, I'm renaming it to JS Vision. The first object we're going to build is called TObject. And it's going to be a very simple object. It's called TObject. Again, it's a little bit difficult for me to write the code and hold the mic at the same time, so bear with me a little bit. So TObject is going to be inherited by just about every other object in our graphical user interface. And what TObject is going to do is very simple. TObject is going to have a variable. It's going to create a variable called this ID. It's going to create a variable called ID for every object. And it's going to give every object a unique ID. So let's call the function unique. ID. It's going to do that. Then after that, we're going to have an array of all the objects, and we're going to add this to an array of all the objects. This is going to be used make coding easier for us down the line. So I'm actually going to call the array an applet list instead of an object list, because since this is JavaScript came from Java, and in Java I used to call this little application applets. So I'm going to stick to the naming convention I used to have. So I'm going to call it applet list. It's an array where the entry, this ID, which is going to be actually a number, unique ID is just going to be a number, and unique number that's going to have is going to point directly to this object. Okay, so that's pretty much what this object is going to do. Then when we finish with the object, we're going to call a function called done, which is going to remove the applet from the list. The reason I'm doing this is because in Pascal, when you created an object, you had to allocate memory for it, and then when you destroyed the object, you were in charge of releasing all the memory back to the operating system. Now you don't have to actually do this in JavaScript. JavaScript has garbage collection. JavaScript is supposed to get rid of the variables on its own. But the way JavaScript works, from what I've read, is that if there's no more reference to an object, it'll eventually delete the object and free up the memory. So if we release this object, but the array is still pointing to the object, then I'm assuming it's never going to delete that object. So I'm removing the object from the array by making the object point to null instead of pointing to the object itself in the array. And this should help down the line, letting the garbage collecting release the object that you are no longer using. So I have to implement unique ID, and I have to create the applet array. I have to do these two things before I'm finished. So 1 second. So in the tab, an empty string. Okay, so we wrote a function called unique ID, which gets called by object, and basically what unique ID does is it takes a variable which initially is set to 0, increments it by 1, and it returns that value. So the first object to call unique ID is going to call this function. This function is going to take this variable which is 0, increment it to 1, and it's going to assign 1 to the object. The next time another object calls unique ID, this 0 had been increased to 1, so now this 0 is going to be increased to 2, and it's going to return 2 to the object, and so on and so forth. So pretty much every object is going to get a unique number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is going to identify it in our library. And it's the fact that it's incrementing makes sure that the number is always going to be changing. So let me save this, and let's just test it out, make sure that the code is working fine. Okay. Okay, this was my old code. So now we're going to be using extend. Well, we're going to be using JS Vision G object. So let's create an object called object1. We don't need to pass any parameters. It's going to call T object. In object1, it's going to inherit everything from T object. Let's also create another object called object2. I have to add this. Okay, so I created 2 new objects, one called object1 and one called object2. They both inherit from T object, and I call the T object constructor function in both of them. So now if I create 2 variables, one variable called object1 of type object1, and another variable called object2 of type object2, let me erase all this. If I see the ID of object1, And the ID of object 2 this one should write down 1, this one should write down 2. They should each get an unique ID. So let me save this. Okay. There were. The first one wrote 1, the second one wrote 2. Perfect. So now I created a simple object called TObject, and that object is going to give a unique ID to every descending object that is created. It's a very simple piece of code, but we're going to be using it a lot in our library. So at least we didn't go without writing any bit of code. So this is our bit of code. TObject. This is the first object that all the objects are going to be reusing, that are going to derive from the most of the other objects. There's going to be a few like T-rect, the and T-point that will not inherit from TObject. So this is it. So to summarize, this is the beginning of a graphics library that we're going to be using for all our games. This is our first object. We're implementing the object of TurboVision, just because I had a book on TurboVision, and we're going to be reusing that library for all our games. I want to do one more thing before I quit. Hold on a second. I don't want to be reinventing the wheel. Since TurboVision is already a well-established graphic library that was built a long time ago, there's a lot of code written for it already. So what I want to do, let me type. All right, so I can. So I'm gonna do it from the outside. Okay. So let's do a search for TurboVision source code. Doing a search for TurboVision source code gives us this. Let's download this version. And let's download this TurboVision 2.03. I'm gonna upload this into my web server later on. I'm gonna see for what reason I wasn't being able to connect to the internet from there. So I downloaded this. TurboVision, classes. And we have already all the code implemented here. We have TView, T window, pretty much all the code that makes up the TurboVision library is already implemented. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel most of the time. So what I'm going to do is just reuse the code that is existing in the library. Here you go. We have a lot of code here already. We're going to reuse as much of the code as possible. Obviously, because this was made for an operating system, the code is not all going to be the same as a web browser code. So we're going to have to change some of the code, but we're going to be able to reuse a lot of the code. So that's it. So just so you could see, up, I closed it out already. But so you're aware, this is the first object, T object, and we're gonna be making this graphic library that we're gonna reuse for all our games. And that's the end of video 1. Video 2, we're gonna be implementing some of the code of the library.